You know that feeling, right? You're standing there, maybe in the grocery store aisle, maybe trying to pick a movie, and you're faced with two options that just, well, they feel completely balanced.
Hmm.
Equally good, maybe equally bad, or just impossibly hard to compare. And for a second, you're just paralyzed.
Totally stuck.
Exactly. It's that classic, almost kind of absurd image. Buridan's ass, the poor donkey stuck right between two identical bales of hay.
Equidistant, yeah.
And supposedly so rational it can't find a reason to pick one, so it just starves.
It's a really vivid picture. It's a bit grim, but it captures a surprisingly deep problem, one that goes way beyond hungry donkeys.
Right. And that's what this deep dive is all about, the Buridan problem, this challenge of choice, of indecision, and how it pops up in places you really wouldn't expect.
Absolutely. And trust me, it shows up everywhere.
Yeah.
We've pulled together some fascinating stuff for this dive.
We have. We'll start with some classic philosophy, texts that have wrestled with this for ages. Then we take a sharp turn into some surprising math, even physics, behind indecision.
Yes, there's math.
There is. And then we'll bring it right back to the real world, modern consumer choices, the supermarket aisle, even into politics.
Yeah, our mission here is to really unpack this whole concept. We want to understand why being stuck isn't just, a frustrating moment for you personally, but maybe an inherent possibility baked into decision-making itself.
And crucially, how we try to break free, how the world around us tries to help us break free.
The clever ways, yeah. And sometimes surprising ways.
Okay, let's dive in. So, at its heart, the Buridan problem is that moment, right? We're frozen between options that seem equivalent. But the idea, it didn't actually start with John Buridan and his donkey in the 14th century.
That's right. It's much older. You can trace a version back to the 12th century, to the Persian philosopher Al-Ghazali.
Al-Ghazali.
Yeah. He presented a scenario that, honestly, some argue is clearer. Imagine a man faced with two identical dates.
Like the fruit.
Exactly. Equally sweet, equally close, equally perfect. No rational basis, no difference to grab onto to prefer one over the other.
So just like the donkey and the hay situation?
Well, Al-Ghazali actually used it a bit differently. He argued the man can still choose one. He suggested there's some inherent quality or capacity within us that lets us differentiate even when reason finds no external difference.
So the idea that you could be paralyzed, he thought that was wrong.
He called the very possibility the philosopher's incoherence. Buridan came along about 250 years later and popularized the donkey version, which is the one most people remember.
And as the source points out, adding the donkey actually muddies the waters a bit, doesn't it?
It does. Suddenly you're talking about animal minds, intention, will, things that aren't really core to the puzzle about human rational choice.
Right. The starving part is dramatic, but maybe distracts from the basic issue of just rational paralysis.
Exactly.
Okay, so strip away the donkey, the dates for a second. What is the core theoretical puzzle here? Why did this grab philosophers so much?
The deep puzzle is this. If our rational choices hinge on having a sufficient reason to pick option A over option B, what happens when the options are truly equal?
Or maybe even trickier.
Or even trickier, yeah, when they're incomparable. It's not just about two identical cans of soup. It's also those big life choices that feel, on a par or maybe beyond comparison.
Where you're stuck not because they're the same, but because you just can't weigh them against each other properly.
Precisely. You feel unable to conclude you really ought to take one path over the other.
Like that really heavy example from Sartre during World War II.
Oh, yeah.
This young man in occupied France, does he join the resistance and fight for his country? Or does he stay home and care for his elderly mother who completely depends on him?
Two vastly different things, both incredibly important duties. But how do you rationally weigh them? How do you decide which one you ought to choose?
You can see why he'd feel paralyzed. There are differences, obviously, but no clear, better choice compelling him.
Exactly. It shows the Buridan's ass case, the simple version, is just a stark illustration of this much wider feeling of being stuck between significant, difficult choices, even when they're totally different.
Okay, so faced with this puzzle, how did thinkers react? Did they just accept paralysis as a possibility?
Well, many really pushed back against it. A common reaction was just to deny the premise entirely.
Like saying truly equal choices just don't happen in the real world.
Exactly. The French philosopher Montaigne, for instance, he believed there's always some choice that, though it be imperceptibly, tempts and attracts us. Some tiny, maybe subconscious difference nudging us one way.
Always something.
Right. And Leibniz, the German philosopher and mathematician, he flat out called Buridan's ass a fiction that cannot occur in the universe.
So for them, the whole scenario was just impossible, a non-starter.
Pretty much.
But others, they sort of accepted it, at least in theory.
Yes, some did, maybe grudgingly. While they might agree the starving donkey scenario seems absurd, they had argued that if such perfect equality could exist, then paralysis would logically follow from the rules of rational choice.
Even Montaigne and Leibniz said the ass would starve in that hypothetical.
They did. And Spinoza, faced with a similar puzzle, admitted he wasn't sure how to classify a person stuck like that. Are they like an animal, an infant, a madman? But he thought these Buridan states were just as real possibilities as, say, infancy or madness.
But that acceptance, it just feels kind of unsatisfying, doesn't it? It doesn't really explain why we don't see people starving in the supermarket aisles.
It really does fall short. The sources point out a few reasons why. First, the argument for why the donkey must starve often feels like just a theoretical outcome of their logic, not something grounded in observation.
Okay.
Second, it doesn't explain why the whole idea strikes most people as intuitively absurd. Why would a perfectly capable adult just freeze up like that?
And the biggest issue, like you said, we see people making choices in situations that feel like Buridan cases all the time, and they almost always manage to pick something.
Exactly. Like the philosophers Ullmann Margalit and Morgan Besser pointed out, think about that supermarket shelf. You check for dented cans, maybe one's too far back. But then you're left with a row of identical cans of soup.
And you just pick one. You don't stand there until the store closes.
Right. You break the tie somehow.
So if the traditional philosophical answers feel a bit lacking, and we clearly do get unstuck, what are the proposed solutions? How do we actually break that tie?
Well, one classic idea you see going back to thinkers like Thomas Gattaker in the 17th century, and later philosophers like Donald Davidson talked about it, is using random selection.
Like flipping a coin.
Exactly, a coin toss.
But how is flipping a coin different from just randomly picking one? Isn't it the same thing?
Davidson's idea was that the coin toss provides a trivial ground for preference when real reasons are missing. It's not that you had a reason to prefer heads, but the outcome of the toss creates an arbitrary difference you can then act upon.
Okay, that makes sense. It gives you something to base the choice on, even if it's meaningless. But wait, doesn't that immediately run into another problem?
It does, the dreaded regress problem. If you have, say, two equally good random devices, a coin and a die, how do you choose which one to use to make your decision?
Oh no. Do you need another coin flip to decide whether to use the coin or the die?
You got it. It's Buridan's problem all over again, just one level up. Choosing the choosing mechanism.
Okay, so random selection is neat, but maybe not a complete theoretical fix. What about other ideas? Things happening inside us?
Right. Other proposals look more at internal mechanisms. Remember Al-Ghazali and the man with the two dates?
Yeah, he said the guy could choose.
His idea was that even without an external difference, some quality in him allows differentiation. Maybe simply letting your focus drift slightly to one of the dates.
Like you just sort of accidentally look more closely at one can of soup, and then that's the one you grab.
Kind of like that, yeah. An unintentional shift of attention creates a subjective difference. More recently, the philosopher Boris Chislenko suggests that often we simply just pick.
Just pick.
Like grabbing a cookie from a plate or drawing a card from a deck. It's not necessarily a reasoned decision, maybe not even fully intentional in the usual sense. It's just an action that breaks the symmetry.
That feels right for the soup can scenario.
Yeah.
I don't rationally decide that specific can is superior. I just reach out and grab one.
Exactly. Acting kind of non-intentionally until the choice is made by the action itself.
Okay, so we've got the philosophy puzzle, the historical arguments, some human strategies like flipping coins or just picking. But here's where this whole thing takes a really wild, unexpected turn. This isn't just philosophy anymore.
No, it isn't. There's a fundamental mathematical, even physical principle that seems to explain the very possibility of getting stuck.
Seriously, math.
Yeah. This is where the engineer and computer scientist Leslie Lamport comes in. He formulated what he calls Buridan's principle. It grew out of thinking about computer systems, specifically asynchronous systems, but Lamport argues it's a fundamental law that applies way more broadly.
A fundamental law, like a law of nature. That sounds big. What is Buridan's principle?
Okay, put simply, it states this. A discrete decision based on a continuous range of input values cannot be made within a bounded length of time.
Whoa. Okay, let's break that down again. Discrete decision.
That means you have to choose one option out of separate, distinct possibilities. Turn left or turn right. Pick A or pick B. Choose this date or that date. The outcome is one specific state.
Got it. Continuous range of input values.
This is the key part. Many real-world inputs aren't just fixed values. They vary smoothly along a spectrum. Think about your precise physical location, the exact moment something happens, even internal states, like how strongly you feel about each option right now.
Infinitely many possibilities on that spectrum.
Exactly. Because it's continuous, there are infinite possible starting points, including points that might be perfectly balanced or infinitesimally close to it.
Like my exact distance from those two closing elevator doors? That's continuous.
Perfect example. Your position, your arrival time relative to the doors closing continuous variables, and bounded length of time.
The deadline. Gotta decide before the car crashes, before the doors shut, before you starve.
Right, you had a limited window to make that discrete choice.
So putting it together, continuous input, discrete choice, time limit, the principle says you cannot guarantee you'll make the decision in time for every possible input value.
That's precisely it. The principle essentially proves that at least one point within that infinite continuous range of inputs, maybe the point of perfect equidistance or perfectly balanced internal preference, will cause the decision-making process, whatever it is, to take an arbitrarily long time, potentially longer than your deadline.
Wow.
There's no fixed upper limit on decision time that covers every single possible starting circumstance within that continuous input space.
Okay, let me process that. This isn't just philosophy anymore. Math and physics are saying there are situations where we might be inherently incapable of guaranteeing a decision within a deadline. That feels huge.
It is huge. And it's not just theoretical speculation. This principle explains a very real, practical problem that computer scientists and electrical engineers have known about since the 1960s. It's called the arbiter problem, or sometimes just the glitch.
Glitch in computers.
Yeah. Circuits that have to decide between asynchronous inputs arriving at slightly different uncoordinated times, which creates a continuous range of timing differences, can get stuck.
Stuck how?
They can enter what's called a metastable state. The circuit isn't definitively a 0, and it isn't definitively a 1. It's stuck in between. And it can stay in that ambiguous state for an unpredictable, potentially very long time.
Causing computers to freeze or crash.
Exactly. And Thomas Chaney, one of the engineers who worked on designing circuits to handle this, explicitly drew the parallel. He asked, can an ass, when placed exactly between two piles of hay, starve to death? This is the same question as the question, can a digital circuit FF remain metastable forever?
So a computer circuit can literally become a Buridan's ass, stuck in indecision between two signals.
In a very real physical sense, yes. The underlying mathematical challenge is the same. And the reason it applies to us humans is that those core elements, continuous input, discrete decision, bounded time, they're present in countless everyday things we do.
Driving, walking.
Perceiving things, reacting, even just thinking things through internally.
That elevator example really drives it home now.
It's a good one. You're rushing, two elevators, same distance, doors closing simultaneously. Your exact position is continuous. Left door or right door, discrete choice. Time limit before they close. Buridan's principle says somewhere in that continuous range of possible arrival points and times, there's at least one sweet spot of perfect balance where the pull is so equal your brain's decision process could take longer than the time you have. You hesitate and miss both.
Okay, I think I get it. The key takeaway then is, well, it's profound and maybe a little unsettling.
It is. This principle gives us a kind of mathematical proof that we are never necessarily decisive in these common situations. It doesn't mean we will get stuck or that it's even likely moment to moment. Obviously, we navigate the world pretty well.
Right, we're not constantly paralyzed.
No. But the inherent possibility of that decision time exceeding the limit, the potential for paralysis when faced with perfectly balanced continuous inputs within a deadline, it's always there. It seems to be baked into the physics of decision-making.
Wow, that really changes the game, doesn't it? It's not just a philosophical curiosity or a story about a donkey. It's a fundamental constraint.
It seems to be.
So if this potential for getting stuck is sort of hardwired into reality, what about the world around us? You know, society, markets, politics. How do they deal with this? Do they help us avoid paralysis or maybe exploit it?
That's a great question, and it leads us straight into some really fascinating applications and implications. First, just thinking about solutions again. If human strategies like just picking or letting focus drift do reliably help us navigate these potential burden states in daily life, the research suggests maybe computer scientists could learn something from that. Maybe there are ways to build systems that mimic these human glitch mitigation strategies. Simply allowing more processing time helps reduce the probability of a computer glitch, but like giving the donkey more time, It doesn't eliminate the underlying mathematical possibility for all inputs.
Interesting. So maybe our evolved brains have workarounds machines haven't quite cracked yet. What about bigger implications? You mentioned moral responsibility.
Yes, this principle raises a really interesting, perhaps surprising, point about responsibility, specifically for omissions for failures to act.
Okay.
The argument laid out in one source goes like this. If someone fails to act, say, they commit an omission because they were, without realizing it, caught in that perfect Buridan equilibrium, that equal pull caused by the continuous nature of the situation. Should we hold them morally responsible? The principle suggests that unless you're omniscient or omnipotent, you can't always control or even predict entering these precise states where your decision processing time just runs out before you can act.
Can you give me that tough example again?
Sure. Imagine someone standing exactly halfway between two children drowning in separate ponds. They can only save one. If they hesitate, frozen for just a moment too long because of the equal pull, which child? How do I even move to maximize chances? And they fail to save either.
Yeah.
The principle suggests we might actually excuse them from blame for that omission. Their failure wasn't necessarily malice or negligence in the usual sense, but maybe a consequence of this fundamental indecision trap, triggered by the situation's symmetry and continuous nature.
And that creates an asymmetry, you said, because there isn't really a parallel for actions.
That's the argument proposed. While you can fail at an action for lots of reasons, being trapped by this unavoidable, limit-exceeding indecision seems uniquely relevant to situations where the outcome is a failure to act, an omission. It's a potential new way to think about excuses for omissions.
That's definitely a lot to chew on regarding blame. What about weakness of will? Acrasia.
Right, acrasia. Usually we think of it as irrationality. You know, you should do X, eat the salad, but you fail to do it because your will is weak and you do Y instead. Eat the pizza.
Giving in to temptation, basically.
Exactly. But think about that drowning child case again. If the person fails to act because they're frozen by the perfectly balanced, equal pull of the options, is that really weakness of will?
I see where you're going.
The principle highlights that maybe such a failure isn't due to weakness alone. Perhaps it's also due to a kind of strength, the strength of the opposing, equally powerful pulls essentially canceling each other out.
Oh, wow. So the failure isn't because the will is too weak to follow one path, but because the competing forces are too strong and perfectly matched.
That's the fascinating twist. It suggests maybe we need a refined definition of acrasia. Perhaps it's failing to act due to weakness of will, without there also being a symmetrical argument that the failure was due to strength of will. This keeps the idea that typical acrasia is irrational, while acknowledging some failures to act might stem from this different, possibly non-irrational, Buridan-type deadlock.
That's subtle. And one more connection, decision theory and uncertainty, especially ethical uncertainty.
Yeah, decision theory often deals with uncertainty about facts or outcomes. Buridan's principle reminds us our internal states are also part of this continuous input landscape. That includes our beliefs about right and wrong, our normative credences.
So my own uncertainty about, say, the ethics of eating meat could itself be part of the continuous input that leads to paralysis.
That's the idea. If you're deciding, under time pressure, whether to switch your steak order to pasta because you're wrestling with the ethics, your level of ethical uncertainty, which can vary continuously, could be part of the input state.
And that very uncertainty could cause the indecision that makes you miss the deadline to change the order.
Exactly. The principle implies this internal normative uncertainty can contribute to the possibility of paralysis and failing to act, even if, in hindsight, you judge switching would have been better. It suggests normative uncertainty isn't just abstract. It can be a concrete factor in why we get stuck, rooted in this continuous nature of our internal states.
Okay, so this problem of being stuck. It starts with the philosophical donkey, but then it expands into fundamental math, proving we can be incapable of deciding in time. It influences how we think about blame and weakness of will, and even shows how our own internal uncertainties can trip us up. It really is everywhere.
It truly is.
Yeah.
And that brings us to a really fascinating practical application of the Buridan problem that one of our sources digs into, the modern marketplace.
Ah, back to the supermarket aisle.
Pretty much. The question posed is the modern consumer basically a Buridan's donkey, constantly overwhelmed by rows and rows of incredibly similar options? Think breakfast cereals, soft drinks, laundry detergents.
Coke versus Pepsi is the classic. I definitely feel that paralysis sometimes just staring at the shelves. So how do we actually make a choice in those situations?
Well, the research argues that product packaging plays a absolutely crucial role here. It acts as a mediator, almost an anti-Buridan device.
Anti-Buridan.
It actively steps in to help us escape that potential indecision. And it often does this using a kind of two-step strategy. First, presenting products as similar, using mimicry.
Okay, making them seem like part of the same category.
Right. And then crucially, highlighting specific differences through differentiation.
Mimicry and differentiation on the package itself. Tell me more.
Okay, take the example used in the source, an old advertisement for Ricard, the French pasties drink. The ad basically says, oh, Ricard, yes. It acknowledges the similarity Ricard, Pastis 51, they're both pasties. But it solves the potential Buridan dilemma.
Oh.
Not by asking you to choose between two identical bottles side by side. Instead, it replaces that spatial hesitation with a narrative. It shows the bottle turning. And the key is the label on the bottle.
The label provides the difference you need.
Exactly. The label is the instrument that gives the answer. It provides that clear, visual, distinguishing information. It lets the consumer say, ah, yes, that's a Ricard. I recognize it. That's the pasties I want. The packaging, the branding, imposes a solution. It gives you an easy criterion, the label, to break the tie quickly. Marketers set up the similarity, then use the packaging to emphasize the specific difference they want you to focus on. The supply side basically preps the choice for you.
So marketers are kind of anticipating that potential Buridan moment and then swooping in with the packaging to give us the easy out.
You could see it that way, yeah. But packaging does more than just differentiate brands. The source explores its dual nature, using Goloways' cigarette packs as an example. Critics often slam the symbolic side, the Gallic helmet, the patriotic slogans, the gendered undertones of Blonde Légère.
Right, the image, the cultural meaning, seeing it as a smokescreen hiding the dangerous product.
Exactly, suggesting people buy the idea or the symbolism, not the actual tobacco.
But the source argues this criticism totally misses something crucial on that same package.
It does. It misses the informational side. Right there on the pack, you've got factual data, tobacco content, additives, manufacturing details, those big mandatory health warnings.
Smoking causes cancer. Yeah.
Right. Origin, made in France, regulatory stuff, eco-labels sometimes, even barcodes talking to the store system.
That's actually a ton of objective information packed on there.
It really is. And this factual info teaches consumers new ways to evaluate products, analytical ways, based on data, not just taste or symbols. It reveals the inviolable stuff about the product, its risks, its composition, maybe its environmental impact, things you wouldn't know from a generic bag.
So the packaging is a screen that hides the physical product but reveals all this other hidden information. That's kind of paradoxical.
It is. It teaches us how to look at goods in a new, more informed, sometimes legally mandated way. It displays the rules right there.
So packaging doesn't just help us choose, it changes how we evaluate things.
And it changes the market relationship itself. It's not just buyer-seller anymore. The package becomes this little platform, like a tiny public square.
A public square? How?
Because different voices are competing for your attention right there on the surface.
Yeah.
The producer saying, buy me. The health authority saying, warning. Environmental labels saying, I'm sustainable. Regulators ensuring compliance. The barcode talking to the scanner.
It's a literal fight for space on the box.
Exactly. Think about health warnings getting bigger and bigger, pushing other things aside. This whole competition creates what the source calls a market of product qualifications. It offers you multiple lenses, emotional, logical, scientific, ethical, legal, to look through and make your choice. It gives you lots of potential criteria to break those Buridan deadlocks.
This gets even wilder when you apply it to politics. Politics gets packaged, too.
The source uses a really striking example, a parody cover of a consumer magazine. It shows French presidential candidates, Chirac and Jospin, depicted as packaged dolls.
Like action figures.
Yeah, with consumer-style labels. Inaction man, moralizator, defective programs, real draw. It's funny, right? Choosing a president like choosing a toy.
Highlighting the absurdity. But then, the Real Consumer magazine actually did test the candidates.
It did, based on actual consumer issues, food safety, money, environment. So the marketization of politics, it happens, sometimes explicitly, sometimes more subtly.
Oh, subtly.
Well, the deeper point is that political discourse itself often gets implicitly packaged by how it's framed. When politicians or the media focus heavily on certain issues, say national security, while downplaying others, maybe consumption issues or foreign policy details, they're framing the choice for voters. They're selecting the criteria, potentially leaving important things out of the picture.
And sometimes they frame political choices specifically as Buridan dilemmas, like these two candidates are basically the same.
Absolutely. And that framing, especially when the media presents the main contenders as almost identical, can lead to really unpredictable voter behavior. They call them recalcitrant voters. The example given is the 2002 French election. Voters were apparently convinced the first round was a guaranteed runoff between Chirac and Jospin, the two main candidates presented as quite similar on some axes. So, feeling the real choice was later, they felt free to express little preferences for minor candidates in the first round.
Which led to the surprise result.
Exactly. Le Pen, from the far right, unexpectedly made it to the second round. The way the choice was packaged and presented as a near-Buridan dilemma in the first round created a situation where voters acted differently than expected. The framing mattered immensely.
So just like product packaging influences how we choose between Cokes, the way political choices are framed influences how we evaluate candidates and ultimately vote.
Yes. And there's one more related trend. Economic actors deliberately embedding political or ethical issues into their products. The politicization of the market.
How does that work? What's an example?
Max Havelaar coffee is the perfect case study here. The product coffee is explicitly linked to a cause. Fair trade.
Right, you see that on the label.
Exactly. Buying that coffee isn't just about the taste. It's marketed as supporting small producers, fair practices, better living conditions. The packaging highlights this ethical and political content. It encourages you to prefer this coffee based on those criteria.
So they're using market mechanisms like branding and packaging to push a political or ethical agenda by making the cause itself part of the product's appeal.
Precisely. It's seen as kind of flipping Marx's idea of commodity fetishism on its head. Marx said the product hides the social relations of production. Here, the production relationship, the fair trade aspect, becomes the appealing feature, the thing that differentiates the product and drives your choice. It's embedding politics into the commodity, giving you yet another non-material criterion to break a potential tie between two bags of coffee beans.
Wow. Okay. So we've journeyed from this timeless philosophical puzzle about being paralyzed to discovering this fundamental mathematical principle proving that paralysis is always a possibility.
Buridan's principle, yeah.
And then seeing how the entire world around us, marketers, packaging designers, political campaigns, is constantly actively working to resolve these potential Buridan dilemmas for us, often by framing our choices and literally providing the criteria we end up using.
Exactly. We started abstract with a thought experiment, found its deep roots in the math of continuous inputs and discrete choices under time pressure. Then we saw how the external world, especially through things like packaging and political framing, steps in to guide us, to help us escape that potential freeze-up. Packaging works on all these levels, emotional, social, logical, ethical, all trying to nudge our decision.
And it really drives home that idea that our preferences, maybe they aren't just these fixed things inside us. They seem heavily shaped by what we look at and how things are designed to make us look and evaluate them.
Yes. Echoing that idea that objects can almost make us choose, like the Gauloises pack making us smoke. The consumer, unlike that poor philosophical donkey, usually gets out of the dilemma pretty fast. Not just because of our own willpower, but because the supply side, the marketers, the designers, the political strategists, they intervene. They provide clear criteria, references, stories that guide the choice, effectively short-circuiting that moment of potential paralysis by giving us the framework to form a preference.
Which leaves us, I think, with a really provocative final thought to mull over based on everything we've talked about. If packaging, framing, and all these external forces are so effective at making us choose by providing the very criteria we use to form our preferences, what does it say about our decisions? Are they really stemming from our own independent will, rationally weighing the options? Or are they more about how skillfully those options are presented to us?